Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mindy Romero, and I am the director of the USC Center for Inclusive Democracy. And as we open up, you are in the right place if you are at a webinar for California's Changing Electorate, an examination of shifting party demographics in California presidential elections. So we have a lot to cover. Today, we have a brief presentation that I'll be giving, as well as, of course, our panel of distinguished participants. We are very fortunate today to have Mike Madrid with us, Eric McGee of the Public Policy Institute of California, and Paul Mitchell of Political Data Incorporated, or Inc. I will properly introduce them when we get to the panel portion of our agenda. Before I jump into the presentation, I want to thank Anna Meyer, who is my lead associate at the Center for Inclusive Democracy and was the lead researcher on this study. So thank you, Anna. All right, so let's jump in to the presentation. So California's Changing Electorate, an examination of shifting party demographics in California presidential elections. So this webinar today is going to be discussing recent research that we released at CID, a research brief of the same title. And you all can, if you don't already have it, you can get it here. If you just snap this QR code, it'll take you to the event page for this webinar. Scroll down, you'll see the brief that you can download, and also our panelists' names, and those are live links, so you can click on those and get their full bios. And if you didn't get this, as I'm showing it right now, I'm going to show this QR code at the end of the presentation as well. I want to thank the Haas Junior Fund. They made this event possible, as well as supporting the research itself and the research brief. Thank you very much for your continued support of our research. And I should also note that, as you can see, this event is being recorded, and a recording will be available on our website and also sent back out to everybody that was registered. And we encourage you to view it again if you're interested, but of course, please share it with your network. And a couple more housekeeping things. We also have 2 new full research reports coming out in the next few weeks. I want to just make everyone aware. You'll be getting notices for these very, very soon if you're on our listserv. But one is focused on who voted and who stayed home in the 2024 general election, and then also looking at voting methods and early voting. And of course, turnout, we're also discussing in those reports as well, voter turnout. And you'll be able to get those on our website. And also, if you're on our listserv, they'll be sent out to you. All right, so jumping into the research for this webinar, a couple of things here. Just want to note that you'll be hearing us break out the change in registration, of course, by, we said demographics, but specifically race, ethnicity, age, party. And there are limitations when using the California voter file. There's 2 main data sources that we use in this report, statewide database and California voter file. They're both the statewide database also originates with the California official voter file and county files. And there are limitations. Not only a small percentage of Californians actually identify their race or ethnicity when they register to vote. It's voluntary in our state, and there are methods that researchers such as us employ to identify the race ethnicity, but we are limited in terms of the groups that we are able to present in our research. And if you look at our appendix, we have a detailed discussion of those limitations. So I welcome you to look at that. And then also in our appendix, we have a discussion of California's historical fluctuation and no party preference registration, which we think is important to note as a caveat to our discussion today. And that it also includes some, we'll say, events that happened with the early days of the implementation of the automatic voter registration or a new motor voter in California. All right, and then before I jump into the data, I just want to note, as we note in the brief, that we're examining, of course, the party that California selected when they registered to vote. Registered voters, of course, may choose to vote for a presidential candidate in California in a general election whose party is different than their own registration. Overwhelmingly in California and across the U.S., the majority of voters vote consistent with their official party registration, but not everybody does. And the degree to which this differs, right, can deviate by election. So just need to note that, emphasize that we're looking at party registration. We do not know how individuals voted. We have a private vote right here in our state and in our nation. So jumping into the research. So bottom line here is that California has shown signs of its electorate shifting right and towards the Republican Party in small but notable ways, particularly among the state's youth. And I emphasize this up front because there's been a lot of conversation, of course, over the last, since the 2024 election, but prior to the 2024 election about potential shifts, or what does this look like? What's the degree, the magnitude, some inaccuracy certainly in the media, or at least additional needed nuance right in that conversation. Of course, great reporting that is out there, but it's a difficult, can be a difficult topic to kind of wrap your head around and to really look at and understand what a shift means and potentially what that could mean going forward. And we're talking about, of course, California, as we're focused on California. So we embarked on this research to help really everyone understand what these shifts really are, the degree of these shifts, and what they could mean. So jumping in. All right, so differences in the vote counts between Democratic and Republican presidential candidates narrowed in 2024, right? If we look at the previous two presidential elections, 2016 and 2020, and you'll see that the brief is focused generally, it's focused on presidential general elections. So looking here, out of the past 5 presidential elections, the 2024 general election saw the highest share of California voters who cast a ballot for a Republican presidential candidate. Now, in all of the charts that I'm going to show you over the next few minutes, there's lots that we could focus on. I'm just pulling out highlights. This is a highlight presentation. But again, I welcome you to look at the detailed brief as well as its appendices. All right. So here we're looking at just actual vote counts, total vote counts. So while President Trump received roughly the same number of votes in 2020 and 2024, Vice President Harris received nearly 2 million fewer votes in 2024 than President Biden received in the previous presidential election. And we've highlighted those two data points, years here at the far right of the screen. Republican Party registration declined between 2008 and 2022, and with a slight uptick. This is overall, right, for all voters, and then we're going to get into that breakout. And I'll take, thank you, this just reminded me, I'll take questions at the end of the webinar. We're going to, because of time, we want to make this short and quick. So I'm going to give a quick presentation, move into the panel, and then we'll take broader Q&A, mostly for the panelists, I assume, but I'm also happy to answer any questions. So looking here, the share of California registered Republicans declined between 2008 and 2022. I should say that's one of our main points. For speed and maybe clarity, I'm just showing you on these next couple of slides, 2020 to 2024. But again, you can look at our brief for the historic data going back to 2008. So after years of decline, the share of Californians who registered Republican increased in the 2024 presidential election, while the share registered Democrat declined. And again, this is all, and we'll break it out by group in just a moment. While white non-Latino registered voters had the highest shares of Republican Party registration of all the groups that we examined, racial and ethnic groups, registered voters of color had the largest shift back to the Republican Party after years of declining support. So here, I'm just double checking my notes. Okay, so between 2008 and 2018, the share, and again, here we're starting on this chart at 2020, but I want to note just the historical numbers. So between 2008 and 2018, that 10 years, the share of Asian American voters registered Republican noticeably decreased, while the share without a party preference surged. And you'll see Asian American on your far left, 2020, 2022, 2024, and you see that for each group, Black, white, Latino, in addition, while the majority of Latino Californians are registered as Democrats, California Latinos are increasingly moving away from the the two major political parties. And while the share of white non-Latino Californians registered Republican and Democrat remained essentially stable between 2020 and 2024, the share of registered voters of color who chose Republican increased, particularly among Latinos. After years of declining shares of registered voters selecting Republican as their party registration, young Californians have begun to move towards the Republican Party in recent election years, again in small proportions, but very noteworthy, while older Californians continue to move away. So we've got a lot going on in this chart. So again, we're just showing 2020, 2022, and 2024. We can't show all the years, that'd be overwhelming. And we're breaking this out by age group. So those 3 election years, and obviously in chunks, 18 to 24, 25 to 34, and so on. And I'm just highlighting 2024 to make it a little easier to see between the different age groups. Hopefully that's helpful for all of you. And make sure I've got that there. Okay, so prior to the 2024 presidential election, young and older registered voters in California became increasingly less Republican and more Democratic from election to election. And in recent elections, as you see here, the share of registered voters under the age of 45 registered as a Republican has been increasing, while the share of those aged 45 and older who are registered Republican has slightly declined. All right. Again, for time, we're just going through this pretty quickly here. Young registered voters of all racial and ethnic groups saw notably larger shifts towards the Republican Party compared to their older counterparts. Latino youth, however, saw particularly large growth in Republican party registration between presidential elections. So here we've got this chart showing you again, now we're focused 2020 and 2024. And it's just, making sure my notes are up. Asian American registered voters, now this is focused specifically for Asian Americans on this particular chart, aged 18 to 24, and again, that's on the far left of your screen, were the only age group to see a decline in registered Democratic shares, while other Asian American age groups saw an increase. So as we go forward, you may want to just focus in on the red portion here of each of these bars. That's the share that is Republican, right? The blue is the share that is Democrat. And you can see that change, right, or difference between young and older. We won't say old, we'll say older. Okay, now Black. Between 2020 and 2024 presidential elections, Black registered voters aged 65 and older were the only Black age group to maintain their Democratic registration share, while all other age groups saw a decline, again, following the blue and the red, just for simplicity here. Let you look at that for a moment. Among Latinos, and now we're looking at Latinos, again, broken out by age group for each of those election years. Among Latinos, Democratic Party registration fell for all age groups between 2020 and 2024, while Republican Party registration grew, notably among youth, particularly among youth. As you see, if you look at the far left, 18 to 24, we see a change from 9%, right, to 13.9, 14%. And again, this is the share of those that are registered, right, Latinos that are registered, the breakout of their registration affiliation. And white non-Latino, while larger shares of white non-Latino registered voters are registered Republican compared to registered voters of color, whites across all age groups saw very little change in party registration between presidential elections compared to other racial and ethnic groups. You see that stability there for the most part, right, by and large. So summary, California has shown signs of its electorate shifting right in small but notable ways, particularly among the state's youth. The question going forward is whether or not recent, right, this is the question. Not only understanding the past and where we're at now, recent past and where we're at now, but do these changes, what do they mean potentially going forward in California? And as we talk in the panel, with the panel, we'll also talk, of course, how California is different or similar to the rest of the nation. But what ways might these shifts translate into impact at the ballot box in the next presidential election? So again, here's that QR code I promised at the end. If you didn't get it at the beginning, this will take you to our event page. You can look at the bios of our esteemed panel and also get that research brief. Now, today's panelists, Mike Madrid, a very well-known political consultant here in California for decades and also nationally, and has been a commentator on this topic for many years. Paul Mitchell, Vice President, Political Data Incorporated. Also very well known, of course, esteemed person here in California, but also a commenter has commented on this topic in recent years quite extensively. And Eric McGee, Policy Director and Senior Fellow for the Public Policy Institute of California. And let me stop sharing. Eric is not only a leading researcher in California on our electorate, but just last year also put out research, released research on this topic, right? Showing the changes, really focused in on changes in that piece in the recent primary, but is an expert himself in depth on this topic. So gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today. I'm gonna jump right into the questions. Everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Fantastic, okay. So first question, this will go to all three of you, of course. I'm gonna ask Eric to take it first. So Eric, what is your reaction? I know you're very familiar, and all three of these gentlemen, I want to let our audience know, also reviewed the brief for us as well and give us their comments. Eric, what is your reaction to the data presented today? How do you explain the changing patterns seen in party registration in California? And were any of the results surprising to you?
Yeah, I would say kind of all of them are surprising in the broader sense that maybe 4 years ago, I would not have anticipated this shift happening. So in that sense, it's kind of all surprising. I think probably what's behind it, if I were going to hazard a guess, is the inflation is probably the biggest thing that drove this shift. The inflation was very painful for a lot of people, and remember, it wasn't just about the price of eggs or milk or whatever. It was also rent, right? Rent went up quite a bit. And that's the biggest line item in any renting person's budget. And that's really going to hit exactly the kind of communities that we're talking about here, young people, voters of color. They're going to be hit harder by these kinds of shifts than others, right? So it's the key question is this going to permanently realign them? Every time you have an election, there's always some people who just don't vote. But they probably would have voted for their original party if they had turned out, some people who actually switched to the other party permanently and say, you know what, I don't want to deal with this other party ever again. And then you have quite a few people still in this day and age who are in the middle and shift back and forth. And so the question that we have going forward, which I don't necessarily have the answer for, is how many people are in that swing category and how many are in those other two categories. And my guess is there still are quite a few who are in that swing category and would be open to persuasion moving back. But there's probably a lot who are permanently in the new camp too. So,
thank you, Eric. Paul.
Yeah, so I think my biggest reaction to this, and I think maybe the theme that I'll have as we continue discussing this, is kind of a yeah, but kind of response. And so the first yeah, but is something that you addressed, and I just want to put a little marker on it. And that is the fact that the starting point for a lot of our analysis has been kind of going back to previous registration methods. And there was a spike from 2018 to 2019 that was massive, where the DMV implemented a voter registration method that, kid you not, defaulted people to being an independent. In order to select a party, you had to go to a different page and do a pull down and select a party. So people that we know, like members of the California Democratic Party or California Republican Party central committees, became independents all of a sudden. And it was because of this kind of weird mechanical device. And a lot of times when I see changes, I don't go directly to kind of that, what is the motivation or what is the organic reason for this change? A lot of times I first try to discount or look at what are the potential mechanical causes of some of this. And when we see Republican registration increasing and even sometimes Democratic registration increasing since 2019, we have to accept the fact that a lot of that is simply corrections for literally the million or more voters who were registered as independents that probably weren't meaning to be registered as independent. The other mechanical device that we have to think about is, in terms of looking at the registration, that every presidential election cycle, we see Republican registration grow because of its closed Republican primary. And in this cycle, unlike in past cycles, every county sent every voter in the state a postcard around November of 2023 saying, if you want to get a Democratic ballot, here's how to request one. If you want to get a Republican ballot, you have to re-register. And so we saw a big bump in 2023, November, December, January of 2024 of voters registering Republican that might not have been organic. It could have been mechanical. People who in their minds had already decided to become a Republican or vote Republican and then realized that they needed to change their registration. The other thing is, along the lines is that, and maybe counter to some of what I've been saying is that sometimes registration, like Eric said, is kind of a lagging indicator. They, in their minds, have changed to be, I'm going to vote for this other party, but they don't immediately change their registration. So while the first 2 points that I've made about kind of discounting maybe the impact of this heightened Republican registration because of mechanics, the other thing could be true. We might be missing some movement in Republican registration or in registration trends because unlike the 80 or so nerds on this call, we all don't immediately go straight to the Secretary of State's website to re-register once we have an attitudinal change. A lot of voters will go several election cycles before they actually change their registration to match how they're voting. And then I don't want to go forever, but the big thing for me is that we need to look at this change, the changes that we see within the context of incoming registrations, not just the overall changes in registration. What I mean by that is, to use an analogy that's, I think, apt for today, if your house is 68 degrees right now and somebody opens a door and a window, and in an hour your house is 72 degrees, your temperature went up. But there's a difference if the heat coming from the outside is 75 degrees, meaning that it's going to kind of cap at 75, it's going up slowly, or if the temperature outside is 100 degrees and your house is going to be 95 degrees in the next half hour. There's a big difference. That incoming registration data, the new registrants, when we look at those new registrants, we see a couple periods wherein Republicans were getting like 29% of voter registration. Among some groups, even young people and even young Latinos, sometimes they were getting higher Republican registration than Democratic registration. So like 34% Republican registration, 32% Democratic registration. Now, that was among a small population that was impacting that overall top number. But it's important to look at that. And when we look at that now, since the inaugural, it's flipped. So statewide, among those newer Latino voters who've registered since the inaugural, it's down to 19 again. Among all voters, it's dropped about 5 points, the Republican registration on people who've registered since the inaugural. So when we look kind of at the temperature coming in from the doors and windows outside, that incoming population registration data is changing now, even as we speak, from what might have been in reports that we get from the Secretary of State's office about registration as of a few months ago. And that might continue.
Thanks very much for sharing that, Paul, excuse me. Really appreciate the recent numbers. Mike, your take.
Yeah, I think probably more than anybody on the panel, I put even less credence on registration as an indicator of what's happening. There's too many issues, be they mechanical or otherwise, that can explain sort of these really small blips. And let's keep in mind, this is a very small movement. I think it's interesting because it's moving in a direction that it doesn't normally move in, right? It's like man bites dog kind of a thing. You got people of color and younger or poor people registering Republican. They're clearly voting more Republican. But I think it's important to understand a couple things. That it's kind of hard to call it a trend because we only really seen it for the last couple of cycles here in California. But this quote unquote trend began outside of California. That's when my eyes started to kind of light up and prick up and go, something significant is happening here. In many ways, California itself has been a lagging indicator. And this, I think, is one of the fascinating untold stories is California is, this most diverse state that kind of, trumps itself or parades itself as sort of we're the tolerant, inclusive group here. And, this is what we do in Blue California. And yet, when it's come to the largest ethnic demographic transformation in the country, California was behind literally all other 49 states and what has been happening here. And when we talk about a realignment, And that's a really important word. I wouldn't call it a realignment, certainly not yet. Certainly not a racial realignment. I think that's a real misunderstanding of both the term racial and realignment. But what I think is really important to understand is what is largely driving a lot of this are class considerations, the affordability issues that Eric mentioned, and what I'm defining as this Latino populism, which is a movement away from both parties. And we've seen this clearly in California, where the anti-Republican sentiment has driven an entire generation of voters and political politicians. We're now seeing just a complete mistrust and disbelief in the Democratic Party, like video game levels of the polling I've been doing since the election, where Latinos are just like, well, I've had it, and they're blaming state government for it. That does not mean they change registration, as was said earlier. And in fact, if you look at probably the single most significant realignment in most of our living history, which was kind of the Southern strategy that was realigned, it took 30 years for party registration to realign and change. Voting behaviors almost always precede changes in registration. So again, it's fascinating to me. I would argue this is much, much more a sign of deteriorating partisanship broadly, a sign of emergent populist sentiment, which is defined largely by just not believing in either party anymore, particularly among younger, poor, non-white constituencies. I think it does portend something really fascinating about California. Finally, in somebody who kind of got involved in politics and was involved in California politics, and what has really, frankly, been a pretty boring 30 years in terms of looking at data and analysis. It's like we look at all this data, it's like, oh, there's 3 competitive seats. It's going to be either progressive Democrat or moderate Democrat. It's not going to affect anything. You look at most other states, and there is some really fascinating stuff going on. California, again, is this sort of outlier. It's why I haven't focused a whole hell of a lot on it. I'm in Miami at the moment, where if you want to look at like Republican registration, 10 years ago, there was a negative 200,000 deficit in Florida. Today, it's a plus 1.5 million. Like, that's a movement. Like, that's something that's happening that you can look at and read. Pennsylvania is the same thing, moving in the same direction. New Jersey, the same thing. California is, again, very, very much a lagging indicator on a whole host of these topics. So something is happening, but it's really more, I think, anti-party sentiment. It's not any evidence in my mind of Latinos or Black voters or young voters becoming more conservative. There's almost no evidence suggesting that, but there's pretty overwhelming evidence that they're becoming more populist and just not believing in the party system, the party structure broadly. And while the Republican Party stands as a more populist party at the moment, you can naturally see, I think, some disaffection in voters moving that direction. And I also think this dramatic decline in voter turnout, maybe dramatic's overstating it a little bit, but this drop in voter turnout is also a sign of that. But that, again, I think that's been a characteristic of California politics for decades now, that people just kind of dismiss as, oh, it's a process problem. Oh, if we just had different ways for people to vote, somehow turnout would go up, and we create new incredible ways. You can vote like by carrier pigeon in this state, right? And it's like numbers continue to stay down and keep going down. It's like, hello, at some point, that's not the problem. Like, how many decades do we have to go and realize maybe that's not the problem? And I think hopefully people will turn the corner and realize there are some more significant demographic challenges that are driving this behavior, as opposed to registration and just structural problems, because I think it is much bigger.
Thank you, Mike. I do have to note, just in case some people might wonder, we do not in California have the ability to vote by carrier pigeon.
Not yet. There's a bill coming.
We do not want to promote misinformation on the webinar. But thank you, Mike, very much. Okay, second question. Again, for all of you, I'm going to ask Paul to take this first. Paul, how is California different? I know that Mike already touched on this, but how's California different or similar from the rest of the nation when it comes to shifting party demographics, as you see it?
Well, first off, while Mike likes the data nationally and California, nothing happens because only 3 seats are in play, I hate the data nationally. One of the big problems with data nationally is you go into a state and you could look at what are the voter registration trends, Democrat, Republican, and what you're getting is like somebody's modeled data as to whether or not this person models as a Democrat or models as a Republican because they don't have party registration in a lot of states. Or they have party registration, but the data isn't updated as regularly. Or they have really dirty voter files with a lot of people who are dead and moved still on the voter registration files. Or they're purging people constantly. Like the data quality nationally is a big pet peeve of mine, so I don't spend as much time looking at national data. I do think that one of the big key topics in looking at California elections and this particular election was that Latino voter participation and turnout and where Latinos were. And in that sense, the national picture has always been much more interesting than the California picture, because in California, we have more of a, I don't want to put everybody in the same bucket, but kind of more of a Latino, cohesive population that votes similarly to other people in their same socioeconomic status and everything like that. When I did redistricting in New York City or New York State, very different. You go into a Dominican American neighborhood where it's Black African American or Latino Black voters, and then you go into a Puerto Rican neighborhood or a population of Venezuelans or Cubans. All around the country, the Latino populations aren't as monolithic as they might be in California, for 90% of the Latino vote in California being much more consistent in their voting patterns with each other. Whereas in other parts of the state, like country, like in Florida, you'll have two Latino populations right next to each other voting completely opposite. And so that is a big difference when we're trying to compare California to the national picture. But then at the other, also keying off of something Mike said, I totally agree with him that a lot of what we've seen is kind of this populist capturing of a lot of young voters. Catalyst did a great report. They do it every election cycle, kind of unpacking all the data in the election. And this time they put out a 100-page report that is 100 different ways of saying it was young people. And that's basically what it was. They said it's young people. Oh, and it's these minority groups, which are largely young people. And then it's this other group that renters and young people. And so it was like dancing around that issue for 100 pages. And that's because a lot of what happened this last election cycle captured the attention of young people in this populist way. And it was a weird one because it's this I'm excited by change and anti these political parties. I like Joe Rogan, Elon Musk, the podcast bro kind of stuff. In fact, the podcasts are funny. The day of the election, the most popular podcasts in the country were Rogan, Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, and the Hawk Tuah girl. That was the 4 most popular podcasts in the entire country. And they were not getting those viewers from voters, especially young voters, who were going to go out and vote for Kamala Harris. So the movement there was really interesting nationally. And I think that the more we focus on that, I think the more we realize that that's very transient as well. That you had that because you have the kind of presidential candidate and league of people supporting him who were very unique, and that kind of movement, I don't think, just transfers to Tom Cotton in 2028 or whoever is going to be more of an establishment Republican candidate the next cycle. So that's one way of saying that I don't think we should be overreacting to what happened this cycle, and that the kind of next wave of what's going to be grabbing that attention to those voters might be a populist theme from the Democratic side.
Thanks, Paul, very much. Okay, Mike.
I think a good way to kind of continue on that line of thinking. If you take a look at what happened in the New York City primary with Zoran Mamdani, and I wrote a piece comparing that to Ruben Gallego in Arizona, both of them who brought in younger working class people of color with completely different messages under the Democratic umbrella. But they did have 2 things in common. And those 2 things were they were running against particularly unpopular candidates, one, but more importantly, they embraced completely running against the orthodoxy of their own party. And that became central to what they were doing, was running against the establishment class, the establishment figures, the establishment's tone and tenor and style. That also, incidentally, is characteristic of 2 other American politicians who have overperformed with people of color and young people, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. So I really don't believe that what we're witnessing is an ideological movement at all. In fact, I think that there's a lot of evidence suggesting that there is this, for lack of a better term, this populist revolt against the political class. I also don't think it's a one-off. I think it's becoming definitive of the digital age. It's becoming a defining characteristic of this new era and this new time that we're in. And so, what does that mean? Well, like I said, I think if you're looking at data and trying to say it's red, blue, Republican, Democrat, right, left, that's a very myopic, very elementary understanding of what is occurring right now, and it's not telling us much at all. There's so much more that I think explains why voter behavior is defying traditional stereotypes. Why is the whole concept of minority in terms of voting behavior changing fast, quickly, dramatically? Why is the working class voting more Republican? Why is it now, when, Democrats are the party of rich white people, like the wealthiest, whitest, zip codes in America are like not just like Ruben Gallego, old Bill Clinton Democrats. They're like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, lefty progressives. And what does that tell us? Like, what does that mean? And really, like I said, I think the right-left paradigm, not to get too involved here, but it's so clearly, to me, it's very clear. And this again began nationally. California has in many ways been a lagging indicator. It's also been, frankly, part of a stifled conversation in California, where we're just we just have such a we live in a media desert for political information in California. There's like 1,000 people in a 2-mile area around Sacramento that actually listen to this stuff. Nobody else really cares. That's another defining feature of California's civic engagement that's very problematic. And what it's done is it's created this very peculiar coalition in the Democratic Party, where it is still largely commandeered by wealthy white homeowners, college-educated homeowners, who are overwhelmingly animated by things like abortion rights, climate change, gun control, trans issues. That's not where working class folks are at. Doesn't mean they don't support them. They do in most cases. But their priorities are so completely different. And this affordability problem has created a schism that is seeing the Republicans pick up these voters despite themselves, not because of themselves. And I think that's really important to understand. And again, I think it's why this whole like right-left discussion, this blue-red Democrat-Republican discussion, and even that way of looking at politics and races is just so extremely limited. I don't think we'll be looking at our politics that way in probably the next 4 or 6 years, because it's not explaining a lot of what's happening even now. It certainly hasn't for the last 2 to 4 years. California's done a good job, but California may also be on the cusp of something much more significant than the rest of the country, because now that the data is finally catching up, the results of voting behavior is finally catching up to the rest of the country, there's just far more to be happening. And our problems, our economic problems, are much greater than everywhere else. We're also, we have a much greater foreign-born population, which is a pretty good indicator of partisan voting behavior. That's changed considerably in 2024. Pew just came out showing Trump got 51% of foreign-born Latino voters nationally. And I'll end on this, or turn over to Eric to get his thoughts. But if you look at the Pew data, which was corrected even after Catalyst data came out, their analysis, and Pew's really the gold standard. It's not a partisan firm. They're an objective firm that's been doing this for a very long time. Nothing to take away from Catalyst. I know the principals, work with them very, very regularly. It's good data, but Pew's been doing this a lot longer. And I think with much greater accuracy, it shows that Trump actually got 48% of the Latino vote, compared to 50, 1%, I think, with Harris. That's basically 50-50, at this point. And what's fascinating is if you take California out, which you can't do, but just for abstract academic purposes, of this vote behavior, that means Trump won the Hispanic vote in all the other 49 states, essentially. He's winning commanding victories in places like Florida, probably in Texas. Illinois, New York closed up considerably. As much as the gap closed slightly in California, New York closed sharply. New Jersey I mean, the new blue New Jersey, right, who randomly votes for these Republican governors every once in a while. I mean, it's looking more and more competitive all the time. If these trends hold, and who knows if they will. But my point is, again, California is this outlier, and it's not an ideological outlier. I believe there's clear demographic data that's suggesting why this rootedness stuck as long as it did in this state, and why it's starting to crack as well.
Thanks, Mike. Eric.
First of all, going back to the previous issue, I think Paul's 100% right that AVR has played a role in all this stuff. There's a kind of mechanical issue. There's a Republican primary issue. When I looked at both of those, though, it didn't completely explain the shifts that we're seeing. It's just kind of part of it, right? And I think AVR in California actually has the potential moving forward, to make these party registration trends be more meaningful, because there's just an enormous, I don't think people appreciate how much churn AVR has created in the voter file. There's just lots and lots of turnover because people go to the DMV to get their driver's license updated or just renewed, right? And they will re-register even when they don't have to, right? Even when they're at the same address and nothing about their record has otherwise changed. So but it gives them an opportunity to indicate a different party registration at that point. But I do agree that party registration is kind of sticky, right? And so it's not necessarily a perfect indicator. It's likely in some ways to be a lagging indicator or a weak indicator, or something broader that's going on in the electorate. In terms of California versus the rest of the country, I haven't seen a lot of really awesome data on voting in California versus the rest of the country, California specifically. And I don't know, when I look at what's going on in California, it sure looks similar to a lot of what's going on in the rest of the country. There's similar kinds of shifts. And in the last election, there was, it's the places that, the counties that had the biggest shift toward Trump were the ones that had the biggest decline in turnout and had the largest Latino populations, right? And that's kind of a broader pattern everywhere. There was a really big shift in California to Trump relative to a lot of the rest of the country. A lot of the competitive places like Pennsylvania and Georgia saw much smaller shifts, right? And I will say that this is always what is certainly in my mind going on right now is we're seeing a reshuffling of coalitions, which always happens after every election. To some extent, but this time, Trump has really, just in his entire time on the national political scene, has really scrambled the traditional political identities and coalitions, and that's going to continue to sort of sort its way out. I expect that we're still going to have a two-party system moving forward, regardless of what Elon Musk does, and what's going to happen is the two parties are going to struggle for a while to try to figure out what their identities mean now that this sort of Donald Trump bomb has been dropped into the middle of everything, right? And so I would expect that, first of all, I would expect that there's that kind of restructuring process is going to take a number of election cycles to completely work its way out. And so you will probably see some shifting back among some groups, maybe not 100%, right? But some shifting back. You're going to see some people who've shifted over to the Democrats. There are a lot of those as well. They tend, as Mike said, to be kind of higher income and more white. But a lot of them are going to stay there forever, right? And that's restructures what each of these parties ends up, what their identities ends up being. But the one thing is that when young people vote, historically speaking, and it could always be different moving forward, but historically speaking, when young people, the first-time voters, vote a particular way, it kind of and decide when they're sort of stepping onto the political scene and voting for the first time to be a particular party identity, that tends to stick with them throughout the rest of their lives. This is the most malleable time for any person in terms of their political identity is like, and the most influential time is like when they're 18 to 26, right? And if they come to a particular identity at that time, they're likely to sort of keep it. It doesn't mean that they don't change their opinions, but they're likely to sort of stick with that for the long haul. So I would actually expect some of those voters, some of those very young voters might shift back in a Democratic direction, but not all of them. And they probably will, moving forward, have a little bit more of a Republican identity. Then, we'll see what the next crop of young voters looks like for the 2028 presidential election. And maybe they'll be more Democratic again. But I would expect the one that you just saw will have a little bit more of a Republican tinge to it. For the foreseeable future. That would be kind of historically speaking, that's what we would expect.
Thank you, Eric. Okay. So this is a webinar, right, held by the Center for Inclusive Democracy. So I absolutely need to ask you all about the impact of the parties and their mobilization efforts when it comes to seeing an inclusive or more representative democracy in our state. So specifically, how do party mobilization efforts and other efforts help or work against the goal of seeing a more participatory and representative electorate in California? And Eric, I'm going to ask you now to take the first stab at that, please.
I think necessarily, and my co-panelists will have more experience with this than I do, but I think naturally, if you're mobilizing voters, you go for the ones that are right on the bubble, right? You want the ones that, except for your mobilization, might not vote. You don't really want to spend a lot of time, if you can help it, on people who are guaranteed to vote, and you don't want to spend a lot of time on people who are guaranteed not to vote. That has meant that there's a lot of people who could potentially, maybe with some concerted effort, that doesn't make sense from a campaign's perspective, but does make sense from kind of a broader ethical perspective. Some people who could be voters but are not because they haven't gotten intense enough outreach, right? So that's always sort of been the case, and that creates somewhat of a bias in the system. I think that the thing that these shifts, if they persist, complicate is that mobilization has been, especially of voters of color, of lower income voters, of young voters. There's been this kind of understanding that benefits Democrats. And so that's motivated the Democratic Party to do this kind of mobilization in a really aggressive way, to a degree that they wouldn't maybe otherwise. If there is no longer that sense, I worry that it could be that just Republicans will pick up the slack and we'll have a bipartisan mobilization process. But I do worry a little bit that if suddenly these voters seem like they're more toss-up, that they won't get as much attention as they even have been getting, which is, again, not as much as some other types of voters. So that's sort of the part that the incentive structure of this shifts a little bit, I think, in ways that I would be worried about, for the sake of just general turnout. Because it's not, what we want is a representative democracy, not because of a particular partisan lean, but because we want every voice to be heard, right? And those are, we have a system where the incentives are built around trying to mobilize people, because it's a privatized mobilization system, essentially, right? We mobilize in order to produce a particular election outcome. And that means as those loyalties shift, it can also shift some of the incentives for the mobilization.
Thanks, Eric. Paul, and I'll ask Paul and Mike, just so we have a few minutes still for a Q&A at the end, just to give brief answers. And I know that that's going to be dissatisfying considering the importance.
So I'll give the brief answer the best I can. So first off, when Eric's talking about a lot of these mobilization efforts being potentially driven by kind of a partisan goal, like Democrats advancing higher registration rates, easier ways to vote because they think it's going to advantage them, that's fine. I believe in doing all these things because I think they can have an effect. I think if we dive into the data, we might see higher participation, even if lower percentages, higher raw participation, particularly in some elections. higher participations from younger voters is a distinct, clear advantage of a lot of these changes in the system in terms of mail voting and different things, even if the intent was maybe for other reasons. I will note that in Orange County, the same-day registrations leaned Republican in those congressional districts, those competitive congressional districts. So Republicans were like, why are we letting people register to vote late? If they had partisan intentions in that critique of the system, that was wrong for them because they were actually gaining votes from late same-day registrations in Orange County. The other thing is that we've maximized so many of these potential gains that used to be done by going out and knocking on doors, registering voters. Every time I see somebody say, oh, we got a $100,000 grant to register voters in California, I was like, go register voters in another state. We've got such high registration rates that the potential advantage of a marginal increase in kind of turnout from a registration effort is really low. Key off something Mike said, or at least what I think was kind of the tone of what Mike was saying, and that was that you're going to get improved results from candidates, from people who energize voters, not from the latest, 15-page report on a slightly different registration method or a slightly different way that we count ballots. It's going to be from those candidates that energize and create turnout from the impact of those kind of exciting candidates, what they're talking about, rather than kind of turf stuff. And that's a different thing than maybe 30 years ago when Democrats really did need to just register more voters before the deadline as the most important thing they could do in an election. That's no longer true, I don't think.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, it begs a really interesting question, which is, as Republicans will increasingly become the beneficiaries of high turnout elections, and Democrats will become increasingly the beneficiaries of low turnout elections. What does that do to the tactics of both parties and the investment structures of both parties? Does it make sense if you are a Democratic nonprofit that does voter registration and turnout drills in Imperial County, for example, to keep turning out more and more voters that are Republican voters? And again, I don't want to take one or two election cycles and try to make them a trend, but this has been brewing nationally for the better part of a decade. It's new to California, but it's not everywhere else in the country. And these are questions that are going to have to be brought up. And there's a lot of just basic assumptions that both parties are going to have to really grapple with. And Paul just said it, I think, very, very well, which is, the Democratic Party for my generation they would just hire ground game field organizers and just go turn out as many Latino communities as you could, and you're going to get 65, 70% of that vote. So who cares if you turn out a couple of Republicans in there? That's not going to work anymore. That's not the way it's going to be. Those 70-30 margins are gone forever, regardless of what happens in the midterms, regardless of what happens with the blowback on the current environment, which I think will happen. We are witnessing something very significant, and the change is very different and unique. And so I think both parties are going to have to grapple with a tactical challenge that they've both built some really faulty assumptions around, or maybe they weren't faulty 30 years ago, but they no longer apply now. And my hope is, I think I take a slightly different view on this than Eric does. I think the incentive structure has never been better when you have a swing your vote that's breaking 50-50. I'm asked oftentimes, what's the ideal vote break for Latinos? And my answer has always been 50-50, because then both parties will see the imperative going to get this vote, even marginal differences. That's never been the case. When it was 70-30, like the Republicans weren't going to go try to get that vote. They were going to kind of stay off it. And I'm hearing that language from Democrats now too. It's like, let's not spend any more money in these communities in the Rio Grande Valley. Let's not spend any money there because look what's going to happen. Right. But there is incentive for Republicans to do it. So the more it's evenly split, the more, again, this is a very non-traditional understanding of what a quote unquote minority voter is. We've always looked at it with a very different understanding of what race and minority means in politics, and that no longer applies. And I think that's, unfortunately, it took 30 years to get here, but here we are. That's good news.
Thank you all very much. This has just been an incredible conversation. This is why we wanted to have this conversation following the brief, to really get into the nuance that needs to be discussed, right? So I'm looking at the chat, and I've answered several of the questions as we went along. We have a few statements, not questions, so I'll let those stand. Just in the last few minutes here, there's one, and I'll let one of you just jump in on this. One question here: do the registration models matter when voting is now a free-for-all, top two vote, primary process? Who would like to take that?
I think primaries would always be harder to predict how somebody's gonna vote because you don't have I mean, in some ways, you actually have more opportunity now that all the candidates are on the ballot together. You can choose a Democrat or a Republican or whatever else is available to you, and so maybe you could certainly model that part of it pretty accurately. I think knowing who somebody's going to choose within each of the party labels is as difficult as ever. That's always a challenging thing.
Thanks. And then the next governor's race may be the best this is the question, maybe the best opportunity for a Republican to win the governor's seat. The trends indicate that possibility. What does the panel think of that prospect? Anybody want to take a quick stab at it?
Zero.
No, zero, yeah.
A zero. And Eric, I assume
Yeah, zero.
0-0. Okay, I knew that was going to be a quick answer to end on. All right. We are at time. So I want to thank everyone that tuned in. I can say that with a webinar. And Paul has labeled all of you as nerds. And, you know, he means that in the best sense of the word, democracy geek, democracy nerd. We just appreciate you being a part of this event, and always, I know many of you are repeat attendees at CIDs, webinars, and in-person events, and we appreciate your participation. Again, a huge thank you to our esteemed panel, Eric McGee, Mike Madrid, Paul Mitchell. This recording will be available soon and sent out to all of you if they have registered, and also again available on our website. Thank you all very much. Have a wonderful day.